I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Meneshian, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, before we begin this edition of the program, I want to remind you that I am without any advertisers or sponsors right now, so I need your help to keep this show going. If you can, please consider donating to the program on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. With that out of the way, we continue our coverage of the events unfolding in Syria, this time with an analysis by Athens-based international relations analyst George Meneshian, who specializes in studies related to the Middle East and North Africa and the Caucasus. We'll be discussing what the overthrow of Assad and the new Syria led by Jolani and HTS mean for various players in the region, including Turkey, Israel, the Kurds, the Palestinians, Iran, and much, much more. We'll also be discussing what this means for the Caucasus, specifically Armenia and Azerbaijan. All that and much more in the conversation to follow with George Meneshian. With that being said, let's get right to it. Welcome to Parallax Views from Athens, Greece, policy analyst and international relations analyst specializing in the Caucasus and MENA, George Meneshian. How are you doing?
Hello. Hello, how are you? I'm fine, thank you.
I'm doing well. There's a lot of news, though, happening in the Middle East right now, and I reached out to you because I've been enjoying some of your comments on social media and your analysis of what's happening in Syria. I've had a number of guests on with various viewpoints on what is unfolding in Syria. What, for you, are the most important points to be thinking about right now with the rise of HTS, the involvement of Israel and Turkey in Syria? What do you think people should be focusing on?
So, in my point of view, we should study Syria, the developments in Syria, on a two-level analysis. So the first level of analysis has to do with the geopolitical consequences of the fall of the Assad regime. And the second level of analysis has to do with what's going on internally in Syria. So let us start with domestic politics, which of course they affect the geopolitical environment as well. So we have some very important developments in Syria. The first is the fall of the Assad regime after 50 years which is very important. The second is the rise of an Islamist group as the ruling group in a country like Syria, which has very special, unique internal characteristics. It has a unique demographic makeup, and it has a long history of internal divisions which has to do with sects, Shia Sunni Muslims, with religion, Christians, Muslims, with geography, the urban areas versus the rural areas, tribal divisions, because in most of Arab countries there are tribes. And of course, we have political divisions as well, because the fallen regime represented modernity, not democracy, but modernity. I mean, secularism, all these things. While the opposition, most of the groups in the opposition, they represented traditionalism or neo-traditionalism, which is a movement which came back to the wider Middle East after the so-called Arab Spring in 2011. And at the same time, with all those divisions, we also have a competition among identities, because there are different identities among Syrians, because most of them, they don't know, are they Syrians, Arabs, just Muslim, or are they affiliated by their tribe, their clan? There are so many divisions, which is very important. And those divisions were important for the development of the Assad regime. And it is normal that we have grievances in Syria right now, because it was one group, the Alawites, which is a sect. So this group controlled Syria for 50 years. They are a minority. Just 10% of Syria of Syrians are Alawites. And they ruled Syria with an authoritarian regime, a militaristic regime, and essentially they suppressed the majority. This is problematic. This is not the first time. For instance, in Iraq, before the US invasion in 2003, dictator Saddam Hussein, he was a Sunni. Sunnis are just 20% of Iraq's population. The majority were Shia. So this is not the first time. And we have other historical examples as well, where a minority, a clan, a tribe, a sect rules a country, and they suppress the majority. But they also suppressed free thinkers within the Alawite community. It was not 100% sectarian. It was an authoritarian regime. So this is a game changer for Syria. Before proceeding in the analysis, we have to remind the audience that Syria faced several problems before the civil war started in 2011, 2012. So there were socioeconomic issues. First of all, let me tell you that I have relatives in Syria, and I have visited Syria more than 10 times before the war started. And myself, I saw all these problems, because of course there was a stability back then, but they faced a lot of problems. For instance, before the war, they used to cut electricity for a few hours per day. It was like it was a failed state. Okay, during peace, they have these problems. At the same time, as I told you, the regime was authoritarian. They used a lot of violence, not openly, in secret, with the notorious Mukhabarat, which was the secret police, let's say, the secret police, and they tortured a lot of people. That's a fact. But at the same time, they provided Syria with stability, internal stability, domestic stability, and because they used to have a lot of problems with neighbors, and it's not just Israel. The Syrian regime and the Iraqi regime under Saddam Hussein, they both represented Baathism. Baathism is an ideology. It's a Arab nationalist, secular, socialist ideology, and both Iraq and Syria, under Assad and Hussein, they had Baathist regimes. Nevertheless, there was a very intense rivalry between the two regimes. And at the same time, we had Syria militarily intervening in the Lebanese civil war and occupying large parts of the Lebanese state until 2005. So on the one hand, it was, let's say, for an Arab country, a stable regime, but at the same time, Syria under Assad, it was involved in regional conflicts and wars, which was problematic, of course. And let's not forget that it forged an alliance with the Islamic Republic of Iran, and this brought a new rivalry between Syria and the United States. That's why the Bush administration told the public that Syria was part of a new axis of evil, alongside Libya under Gaddafi, North Korea, Iran, etc. Now, internally, the problem is that there is an uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen next, because first of all, we know that the new regime is not democratic. It will be another authoritarian regime. That's a fact. We know that.
If I could interrupt, so with regards to this new regime, we hear a lot about HTS and Jolani. I think some people want to believe that because Jolani has denounced al-Qaeda, that, oh, this is going to be a more liberal regime. I think that even if Jolani and HTS are less interested in jihadism, it's still an Islamist movement, and it's going to be very authoritarian.
Yeah, but apart from that, we have to take a very important factor under consideration. So HTS is a group of organizations. I mean, there are a group of organizations led by HTS. Okay? So under HTS, there are dozens of groups. All of them are Islamists. Some of them are less radical. Some of them are more radical. There are even some foreign groups of jihadists from Chechnya, from Central Asia, from other Muslim countries, even from the Balkans, from Europe. So this is problematic, not only because we know that the nature of the new regime won't be democratic. Maybe it will be less authoritarian than Assad, but it will be authoritarian. But the problem is to contain all these groups, because it is clear that almost 10 days, 2 weeks after this new Syria was established, after the fall of the Assad regime, there is, in certain areas of the country, there is anarchy, chaos. Because clearly, HTS, which is now focused on Damascus and its foreign policy and state building and trying to forge institutions, etc. In the countryside, there are certain groups that are affiliated with HTS, and they do whatever they want against minorities, against people that used to be collaborators of the Assad regime. So this is very, very, very problematic because Syria needs order. If you don't have order and you have chaos, then you have revenge killings, executions, vandalism. For instance, today I was reading that again they vandalized some churches in Hama city. So maybe Al-Jolani, which is a nickname, it's a nom de guerre actually, because his surname is Al-Shara. Al-Jolani means that he's from Jolan, the Golan Heights occupied by Israel. Anyway, so maybe let's say that Al-Jolani is an honest person. Let's say, I mean, it's a scenario. Let's do a hypothetical scenario now, and let us say that Al-Jolani is an honest man, and he really wants to form a just regime which will be fair towards minorities, etc. But clearly, he cannot control everyone because, as I told you, it's a group of organizations. It's a plethora of organizations, and it is not a tactical army. It is not part of armed forces. There are several paramilitary or terrorist organizations involved in this umbrella under HTS. And in order to have peace and order in Syria in this transitional period, those groups need to be dissolved or integrated in the new army. Otherwise, we will witness acts of vandalism or persecution against minorities, but not only minorities, even other groups of people like women or secular Muslims, etc. So it's quite problematic. At the same time, it is very important to tell that the regime has fallen, but the war is still ongoing because it is the Kurdish question right now. It is still there. And we see Turkey, which has militarily intervened in Syria 4 or 5 times. And there are also Turkish troops stationed in Syria, occupying parts of northern Syria. I mean, it's an illegal occupation. So Syria has a proxy in Turkey has a proxy in Syria. It is the so-called Syrian National Army, which is also a coalition of various groups. And this coalition of groups include some remnants of the old armed opposition. It includes the Syrian Turkmens, which is the Turkish minority in Syria, and their armed groups. It even includes some mercenaries and some former members of terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda or even ISIS. There are ISIS veterans in the so-called Syrian National Army, which is under Turkish control. These are facts. And of course, I call them mercenaries, not rebels, because we saw that Turkey in the past few years sent these men in Libya to fight against the Libyan National Army. It sent these men to Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan in order to fight the Armenians. So there are mercenaries, and their primary goal is to fight the Kurds, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, to dismantle the autonomous polity created by Kurds and Arabs in northeastern Syria with American support, and to dissolve the Kurdish armed groups in eastern and northeastern Syria, and to move away Kurdish populations from the Turkish-Syrian border in order to create a buffer zone. So I want to be objective. Turkey's concerns are partially legitimate because, in fact, in those Kurdish organizations, some groups are affiliated with the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK, which is a Kurdish armed organization that fights Turkey for the last 50 years. And it is designated as a terrorist organization, not only by Turkey, but even by the US, the European Union, and some other important countries. Yes, it is a fact that some groups in Syria, some Kurdish groups in Syria, they're affiliated with the Kurdish Workers' Party and the Turkish Communist Party, which is also recognized as a terrorist organization by Turkey and by the US. Those are facts. But not all the Kurds in Syria are terrorists. That's a lie. That's a blatant generalization, you know. So that's not a fact. And this cannot justify an invasion, and this cannot justify crimes committed by the so-called Syrian National Army, because unfortunately, in these groups which formed the Syrian National Army, which is Turkey's proxy in Syria, we have seen several fighters and mercenaries committing heinous war crimes against Kurdish and Arab populations and Christians. And also, unfortunately, they have ethnically cleansed parts of northwestern Syria, like Afrin and some other areas. This is very problematic. The good thing about HTS is that they try to find a peaceful solution to integrate the Kurds into the new reality in Syria. This is good. I mean, the bad thing is that they're conservative Islamists, and we don't know what the future is about Syria's minorities, Syria's women, etc. But at the same time, we have seen some positive things, and negotiations with the Kurds. It's a good thing. It's a good thing because it means that they don't want to fight the Kurds.
So, I guess what I want to ask is, it seems like there's legitimate concerns to be had about HTS, but it's not as simple necessarily as some people who I think are pushing propaganda lines. There's a lot of different factions that push very specific lines that are often very exaggerative, but it sounds like there are real concerns about HTS, but we're going to have to see how things play out as well.
Yes, I mean, HTS, it's still recognized as a terrorist organization by the US, the UN, the European Union, even Turkey. Turkey, which supported HTS and supports HTS. So we have to wait and see what is going to happen in Syria. We have to see, first of all, if they're gonna be punctual regarding the new constitution, and if this transitional government, the HTS-led transitional government, it will remain transitional and not permanent. So we have to wait. But the important thing is that the US, the EU, and the international community in general, they have to put a lot of pressure against HTS, and they have to make clear that if you want to reintegrate into the international system, you have to show us that you're not going to persecute minorities. You have to show us that you're honest about all the things that you have told, so on, so on. So we have to wait, and the Western governments and the international organizations, they have to be decisive, and they have to show HTS that they're serious. If you don't respect minorities, isolation of Syria will continue. We will not lift the sanctions. You will never be welcomed in the UN again, and so on. So they have to make it clear. And if they make it clear, then perhaps the HTS will be forced to control the various groups rampaging the countryside and form institutions. Okay, they represent political Islam. They are not the only regime doing so. However, they have to protect minorities. For instance, even Iran, which is an authoritarian regime, a very conservative regime, and it has committed various crimes. But even Iran, which is a bad example, but even in Iran, Christians are not harmed. They're not 100, of course, they're not free, no freedom of speech, etc. But at least they can continue to practice their religion. That's something. This does not mean that we support Iran, right? But you understand my point. I mean, even this kind of regime, which is brutal, suppressive, they have some guarantees for their religions. Besides, in Syria, just like in Iran, Christians are a small minority, and they're spread all over the country. They're not like the Alawites or like the Druze or like the Kurds, which are in specific regions. They're everywhere. So they would never, ever pose a threat for any regime in Syria, either it's Assad, HTS, or whoever else. So this is clear. For now, we have, but the thing is that we know all these things, but we are not certain about what's going to happen. And this is alarming. This is worrying, because there is this uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen next. And you also mentioned Israel, the Israeli occupation, the Israeli military operations, the ongoing operations. So what's happened is, like, Israel was both satisfied and unsatisfied with the developments. Unsatisfied because they didn't like Bashar al-Assad, but they knew it was him. They knew that he wouldn't attack Israel. They knew who was Bashar al-Assad. And at the same time, they are dissatisfied because they're afraid that some of these radical groups, by the way, some of them supported Hamas's attack on October 7. Israel didn't want these groups to have access in Syria's arsenal. So these are the two concerns. They knew Assad, and they were afraid of these radical groups. But at the same time, and the third concern is that they don't want Turkey to be very powerful in the region. But at the same time, they were satisfied because the fall of the regime was a decisive blow against the Iranian-led axis of resistance which is a regional alliance led by Iran, and the members of this alliance was the Assad regime, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in the Gaza Strip, the Shia paramilitary groups in Iraq, and the Houthi group in Yemen, among others. There are other members too, but these are like the main members of this axis. So Iran, everybody knows that Iran is the biggest enemy of Israel. It poses a threat to Israel's security, and Iran used Syria to transfer weapons and militias close to Israel. So now Iran had to evacuate Syria a day or two before the fall of the Assad regime. So this is very good news for Israel, because at the moment Iran has no military or paramilitary presence in Syria, which is a neighboring country of Israel. And at the same time, Hezbollah, this organization in Lebanon, now Iran has no access to Lebanon, land access, and they cannot transfer weapons or militias. And the most important thing, there is no access to the Mediterranean Sea for Iran. This is good news for Israel. So the fall of the regime was both good and bad news for Israel. So in order to prevent from these radical groups to control Syria's arsenal, Israel decided to conduct hundreds, more than 500 airstrikes, and it has destroyed almost 90% of Syria's arsenal, the missile systems, the air defense systems, all the airplanes, the jets, the fighter jets, helicopters, even naval facilities, even tanks, the artillery. Essentially, Syria has no arsenal right now. It's over for Syria. They have to build it up from the beginning. But at the same time, Israel decided to expand its military occupation beyond the Golan Heights. So the Golan Heights were occupied in 1967 during the Six-Day War between Israel and the Arabs. It was, and I'm telling that it is a military occupation. It's according to the UN, according to international law. This is not a personal opinion. This is according to the United Nations, according to international law. It's an illegal military occupation. So they decided to expand the military occupation beyond the Golan Heights, and in order to create a buffer zone. But in my point of view, and this is my opinion, it's not only for security reasons. They want to show who's the boss in the region. They want to show everybody that we are strong, we can do whatever we want, you will never pose a threat against us. That's the message Bibi Netanyahu wants to give to all its neighbors, his neighbors, not only his neighbors, but also Turkey, Iran, and other actors as well. But this is problematic because now that Syria is trying to achieve stability, having Israel occupying parts of your territory, it's not helpful in achieving stability. It's problematic. It's problematic. It's as problematic as the Turkish aggression in northern Syria against the Kurds. They have to negotiate with Damascus at the moment and find a diplomatic solution for everything. And HTS had showed also a, a good, let's say, HTS also tried to avoid confrontation with Israel, which is important. Not only because they want to convince the US and the rest of the world that they're good people, but mostly because they can't afford a war against Israel. They don't have the military capabilities. Even before the destruction of Syria's arsenal, they would never defeat IDF. It's a fact. Because let me remind you that the HTS and its affiliated groups, they're not an army. They are well trained for a paramilitary group. They're well trained. They have some equipment provided by Turkey, not only by Turkey, but it's not an official army. This is very important. And they don't have a lot of fighters. There are 20,000 maximum. So that's why they can't comfort Israel, and they can't control all these individuals or smaller groups in the countryside that they do some bad things, vandalizing, looting, or terrorizing minorities.
Is there a concern when it comes to HTS of or just this vandalism and looting with rule of law? So I know there's a lot of anger towards people that were seen as collaborators to the Assad regime, but you just can't have, revenge killings. There needs to be some rule of law and a process in
Yes.
which people can be, judged without, there has to be a rule of law in confronting collaborators. Would you agree with that? Or
Yes, of course I do agree, but it's impossible right now because essentially HTS is constructing it's trying to construct a state from scratch because they can't trust they have interactions with former regime like judges or politicians, but they try to build something new. And at the same time, these are the first weeks. They can't control everyone, as I told you. They have to dissolve all these smaller organizations, or they have to integrate them into one Syrian army. This is very important. Otherwise, not rule of law, you can't have order, which is the practical thing. But rule of law is very important, and I'm not optimistic because rule of law, in order to have rule of law, you have to have independent institutions. You need to have some on some like not democracy, but you can't be 100% authoritarian in order to have rule of law. And I'm not optimistic, as I told you in the beginning, because HTS is not a democratic force. But we have to wait and see, because in the diaspora there are all the liberal, the democratic people of the Syrian opposition. They were in exile since 2011. If they return to Syria and try to get involved in politics, maybe we could be more optimistic about Syria's future. But I have not seen them getting involved because they don't like HTS. HTS is one of the reasons they stopped fighting, and they left and they went to Turkey or Europe, the Netherlands, London, the UK, etc. So they don't like HTS. They don't like their ideology because many of these leading opposition figures, the liberal opposition, they called them, they were secular, democratic. They didn't want Sharia, the Islamic law. They're against Sharia. They're against Salafism. They're against political Islam in general, or at least they're conservative. They're against conservative political Islam, because there are so many different kinds of political Islam.
I think that's very important to note because it can get complicated, and I think there's a lot of I don't want to drift into like Islamophobic sentiment when we talk about political Islam, and that's always a landmine.
Yeah, because I mean, even within the jihadists, there are different movements, there are different ideologies. It's not a thing. It's like, I mean, if you were in Europe, it would be easier to explain it to you because in the US it's different. But it's like leftist parties in Europe or in Greece, in France, in Italy, everywhere. The left is fragmented. There are different ideological movements: Leninists, Stalinists, Maoists, Trotskyists, different kind of leftist, communist movements. Political Islam is the same thing. There are so many different movements within political Islam. For instance, there are political Islamists. There are representatives of political Islam that are against the Sharia law, the Islamic law. There are others that are in favor of implementing the Islamic law, etc. So there are so many differences. Unfortunately, ideologically speaking, HTS is quite radical regarding political Islam. And there are elements within HTS that they want to establish a very conservative Islamic state.
And these elements, my understanding is the elements of the rebels of HTS have engaged in the past in violence against civilians. Is that true, or?
First of all, their leader was a terrorist.
Right.
He was a member of the Islamic State of ISIS. Before ISIS, it was the Islamic State of Iraq. It was formed in Iraq, this terrorist group. And al-Shara or al-Jolani, he was a member of IS, of the Islamic State of Iraq. Afterwards, he returned to Syria and he led the Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda, which it's also a terrorist organization. In the US, you know it, with the Twin Towers. So, and later, he separated himself from Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and he even waged wars against Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And he wanted to cleanse his territory from these elements. So he changed. And also, before 2017, they established an emirate, an Islamic emirate, like when they were Al-Qaeda in Idlib. Idlib is an area in northwestern Syria. It was the area that HTS controlled before the fall of the regime. So, but after 2017, they changed it. They established a more civilian government, let's say, and at the same time, they denounced terrorism. They denounced radical jihadism, and they also stopped being only Islamist. They started talking about Syrian nationalism, which is very important. And it was a very clever move, if you ask me, a very wise move, because with these changes and this rebranding, they achieved to gain the support of many Syrians that they didn't like Assad, but at the same time they didn't like Al-Qaeda. So with this rebranding, it became a major factor within the Syrian opposition. This is very important. And all these efforts allowed them to be welcomed when they captured Aleppo, Hama, Homs, all these towns, because not all Syrians are Islamist. Come on. Many are secular. Because we have everywhere in Europe, in the US, there are those stereotypes. I've been to Syria. I told you earlier. I've been so many times.
You have family there, I believe. Yeah.
Yes, my family belongs to the Christian minority, but I have also met Muslims that they're not even religious. Some of them are atheists, some of them are secular, So this rebranding helped them to gain support of many Syrians. But at the same time, because everybody knows about their past, they're suspicious. They're not totally convinced like us. The observers like us, even in Syria, they're not totally convinced, and they're afraid.
When you
They're
say like
worried.
us, you're saying you're not convinced either. Yeah.
Nobody's convinced. The US government is not convinced. The European Union is not convinced. The Arab states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, Egypt, nobody's convinced. So we have to wait. But allow me to speak a little about the geopolitical consequences of these developments in Syria, the latest developments. So the first, I already told it's the end of Iranian hegemony over this Shia crescent, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. So it was a big, maybe the final blow, we don't know, maybe it's the final blow, but it was a decisive blow against Iranian influence in the Middle East. And this Iranian-led axis, it was already weakened because of the Gaza war and the war between Israel and Hezbollah, which ended with a ceasefire, a US brokered ceasefire, a day before HTS started attacking regime forces in Aleppo. So everything is connected. And in my point of view, the October 7 attack of Hamas against Israel, it is a day that will change the Middle East forever. Because if we never had this attack, Hezbollah will be much stronger right now in Lebanon. The Assad regime would probably be there today, and the Iranian influence would be there too. Another factor is, of course, the Ukraine war, because right at the moment, Russia is struggling to capture more territory before Trump becomes president and starts the negotiation between Ukraine and Russia. And they couldn't support militarily Assad as they did in 2015, because if there was no Russian intervention in 2015, Assad would have fallen in 2015, 2016. So they saved Assad back in the mid-10s, but now they couldn't do it because they are focused on Ukraine at the moment. At the same time, Turkey becomes a major actor in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean.
I wanted to ask you more about Turkey in this regard because, I mean, uh, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I feel as if Erdogan has great ambitions when it comes to this region. Maybe I don't know if this would be going too far, but almost like neo-Ottoman or at least expansionist ambitions. Is that the case?
Yes, I mean, he doesn't want to occupy all the lands in the Middle East, of course. He's not crazy, but of course, Turkey is following an expansionist policy, not only towards the Middle East and North Africa, but also in the Balkans, in the Horn of Africa, in the Sahel region, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, everywhere. They follow and they have adopted an expansionist policy, and they have allowed Turkey to become a major regional actor with global ambitions, let's say. So, and Erdogan essentially, while in 2019 everybody believed that Erdogan plans have failed, now we can't say that because Turkey essentially controls the Western government in Libya. They have a great ally in the Gulf, which is Qatar, a wealthy ally, and they have a large military base in Qatar. They have excellent relations with Iraqi Kurds, with the Kurdish leadership in northern Iraq. They have normalized relations with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And now they have a new ally in the region, which is Syria. And Syria is also important because it's an Eastern Mediterranean country as well. And Turkey has also ambitions in the Eastern Mediterranean regarding the maritime zones in Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean Seas. So Syria, it's a huge victory for Turkey at this moment. And at the same time, it's a victory, as I told you earlier, for Israel, because they don't have Iran in their border, nearby their border. And at the same time, they have destroyed all of Syria's arsenal. So Syria can't pose a threat for Israel for the next 50 years or so. So these are very important factors. Geopolitically speaking, this regime change is also problematic for Egypt, and in a lesser extent, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates, because the rise of Islamists in Syria could have a domino effect, like the Arab Spring. It started from Tunisia and it spread all over the Middle East. So they are afraid that in Egypt, they will try to do the same thing because Egypt faces so many financial difficulties and socioeconomic problems at the moment. And the regime, the Egyptian regime under General al-Sisi, it has the support of the army, of course, and it has the support of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, the two regional, the strongest Arab countries. But at the same time, it lacks public support. It is very authoritarian, almost like Assad. It's very authoritarian, and it has led to serious. Its policies has led to serious problems: inflation, unemployment, lack of goods, and other problems for Egypt's citizens. And the developments in Syria are very alarming for the Egyptian regime as well. The difference is that Egypt is not isolated like Assad was, because it's a partner of the US. It has very good relations with the European Union. It has good relations even with Israel, let's say, and with other factors too. So maybe it's not in danger, in peril, the regime, but at the same time, it's very problematic for all these regimes in the Middle East, the Arab regimes in the Middle East, because they are afraid that a new wave of uprisings would start after the fall of the Assad regime in Syria.
I just had one or two more questions. The first is I wanted to get into this near the end here. What does this mean for the Caucasus? What does this mean for Armenians and other groups in that region?
So, what does it mean for the Caucasus? So, now that Iran is weakened, and Iran is a very important actor in the Caucasus, and it's a neighbor of Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now that Iran is weakened, perhaps they will use the Caucasus against Iran. I mean, not the countries, like the region. They will use the region against Iran. But at the same time, with the weakening, with the collapse of the Iranian coalition in the Middle East, Iran will try to use the Caucasus to expand its influence beyond the Middle East. They want to have influence and presence in the Caucasus, and they want to safeguard the corridor that connects Iran with Russia. And this corridor passes through the Caucasus. So this is important. At the same time, now that Turkey is stronger, geopolitically speaking, it may try to expand its influence in the Caucasus as well, not only the Middle East. Turkey has a very strong ally in the region. It is Azerbaijan. They're very strong allies. And the Caucasus is important for Turkey because it allows Turkey to be an energy and trade hub. Because through the Caucasus, the middle corridor of the Belt and Road Initiative passes through. And of course, some pipelines as well, which is important for Turkey to be a key energy and trade partner of Europe at this moment that Russia is isolated. So for Iran is dangerous, but also it provides new opportunities for Iran. For Turkey, they will continue to expand their influence. And also the Caucasus is important for Turkey because it is the gateway to Central Asia, which is a very important region for Turkey as well. And the other thing is that now with all the attention to the Middle East and Ukraine, Armenia is under threat because Azerbaijan, at this moment, it is acquiring more weapons from various countries, from Israel, from Turkey, even from some European countries. They buy ammunition and other equipment from Slovakia, from Bulgaria, from Serbia, from Italy, from Romania. So they build up their military forces. Why? Because they want to impose a peace treaty on Armenia. So they want Armenia to capitulate. They don't want to have an agreement, a peace deal based on mutual compromise, because now they have the upper hand. There is an imbalance between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is much stronger at the moment. Armenia is isolated, is weaker, and it has no major allies that they can protect Armenia. Armenia's traditional ally was Russia, but now they have problems in their relations. They're not in good terms. And at the same time, Russia, as I told you, is focused on Ukraine. But apart from Ukraine, relationship between Armenia and Russia isn't good at this moment. So Azerbaijan will try to, perhaps it might try to take advantage of this chaos in the Middle East and with the situation in Ukraine in order to threat to use its force or to use its force against Armenia in order to impose a peace treaty and have Armenia capitulate and gain more territory and other things from Armenia. So the situation.
So this is a scary time for Armenians.
It is very scary because they are alone, no real allies, and they don't have the military capabilities to engage in a war against Azerbaijan, which will have the total support of Turkey in a case of a war against Armenia.
The very last thing I wanted to ask you, and I don't know if you're able to answer this, but I'm wondering what all of this means for the situation of Palestinians, not just Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories, but also in Syria, where they've faced, there's been human rights abuses against Palestinian Syrians. What does this mean for Palestinians in the region? And again, I'm not even talking necessarily about groups like Hamas. I just mean the Palestinian people.
So in Syria, we had some armed Palestinian groups that they had aligned themselves with Assad. So it's not only the Palestinian refugees. It's important to see what's going to happen with the armed groups of Palestinians that were part of the Assad forces, and they fought alongside Assad all these years. But these are not aligned themselves with Hamas. They are secular, leftist, Palestinian nationalist groups. They fought alongside Syria during the Lebanese war back in the 1980s. And after that, they settled in Syria, and they continue to receive training and support from the Syrian regime. So at this moment, a few days ago, I read that the new HTS-led government is going to disband these groups, but we don't have any update regarding this situation. So we don't know what's going to happen next. But Palestinians in general have a lot of problems at the moment because what's going in Palestine, it's a tragedy for them, and they don't have a leadership. I'm not talking about Hamas. I'm talking about the Palestinian authorities. They're weak. They can't do anything for their people, and they cannot challenge Israel's might. at this moment. This is problematic for them. And at the same time, you can see most of the Arab states that they don't care anymore about the Palestinian question or the so-called Palestinian cause. So it's a huge problem for them. And the fall of the Assad regime is also a problem for them. Although we have to remember that Hamas, so it's very interesting. So both Hamas and Assad were part of this axis of resistance, the Iranian-led axis of resistance. But at the same time, until 2022, Hamas was against Assad, while both were part of this Iranian-led coalition. They fought each other. Until 2022. In 2022, there was a rapprochement, a normalization between Assad, the Assad regime, and Hamas. But then we saw when Israel attacked Gaza as a retaliation for the October 7 terrorist attack, Assad did nothing against Israel. I told you earlier that Israel didn't like Assad, but they knew who Assad was, and they were very happy that he was under Russian influence.
In a way, maybe Israel thought it was better to have an Assad than a wild card like HTS.
And apart from that, now we see that the secret services of Syria and Mossad had contacts. So Assad didn't care about his ally Iran, and maybe he provided some information to the Israelis regarding the location of Iranian and pro-Iranian forces in Syria, on Syria.
This is based on some reports of these leaked documents. Yeah. I'm going to be doing a whole show on that, but
yes, I mean that's why I told you they might did it. We're not 100% positive yet.
Right, the documents need to be verified, but yes, I don't think it's implausible.
But probably they did it. Because yes, Iran was an ally of Syria, but at the same time, Russia had more influence on the Assad regime. So Russia had some agreements with Israel. It allowed Israel to strike against Iranian and pro-Iranian targets within Syria, because Russia had the air defense systems. They could stop some of them. They didn't want to stop it. It was an arrangement between Israel and Russia. And this is not a theory, it's a fact, right? So, and they knew that Assad was under Russian influence. So they didn't like the fact that Iran was present in Syria, but at the same time, they knew that Assad could never pose a threat against them. So their goal was to get rid of the Iranians, to get the Iranians out of Syria, but not necessarily the fall of the Assad regime. I'm not telling they were allies, Israel and Assad, but if Assad survived and Iran was out of Syria, Israel would be happy. While now there is an uncertainty. So there is an uncertainty for everyone, for the minorities, for the Syrian nation in general, for Israel, for the West, for the Arabs, for Iran, for Russia. So everybody is uncertain about the future of Syria and what's gonna happen next.
I think that's a good note to end on. I want to thank you again, George Meneshian, for coming on Parallax Views. My listeners can follow you on Twitter, Blue Sky. Where are you at?
Twitter, LinkedIn, of course, but mostly Twitter, X.
Okay, and if people just look you up there, they can find you. Thank you again. I have another interview, but thank you for coming on Parallax Views.
Thank you.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.